All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Shortly, a little while ago, the Liberal Shadow Ministry decided on our policy, and I'm here with Shadow Minister Dan Tehan and John O'Daniam and Anne Ruston to let you know what that policy is and to take your questions. Australians deserve affordable energy and responsible emissions reduction. And the Liberal Party believes we can do both. But affordable energy must come first. Under Labor, there has been this trifecta of failures. Prices up, reliability down, and emissions flatlining. Labor's net zero policies of mandates and taxes are hurting businesses and they're pushing up prices. Despite promises of cheaper energy, prices have increased substantially under Labor. So Labor's energy plan is actually not a transition at all. It's a demolition job on households, on businesses, on families, and on jobs. Under the Liberal Party, affordable and reliable energy will come first. Our emissions reduction goals will never come at the expense of Australian families, and this is the principle that will guide every decision we take. To keep faith with that commitment, the Liberal Party will remove a net zero target from our policy, and if elected, we will remove the 43% 2030 target and its net zero by 2050 target from the Climate Change Act. We remain committed to the Paris Agreement and to doing our fair share to reduce emissions, but we will do it in a way that protects households and budgets and keeps our economy strong. Now, I know what it's like to be a mum with the bills piling up. And in the last 6 months, I've spent a lot of time talking to mums with the bills piling up, struggling with kids, with costs, with the daily commute, and with an electricity bill that is just rising month after month, a 40% increase since Labor was elected. And I've sensed the anxiety that I have felt when my electricity bills were piling up on the kitchen windowsill at the farm all those years ago, and I had no idea how I was going to pay them. Now, Australia should be a country where no one has to make these sorts of choices. Australia should be a country where we use Australian resources to help Australians first. Australians were promised that life would be cheaper under Labor. You all remember that, but you all know that Australians have been absolutely crushed by cost of living increases. So let me first address those Australians this morning. You are paying too much for your power and it's not okay. Labor went to 2 elections promising you that they would deliver cheaper electricity. And instead, power bills are going up 40%, and that's not okay. Now, I see the Prime Minister has popped up today and, as usual, is focused on the opposition, focused on politics, not focused where he should be, on ordinary Australians who are struggling. So I just want to make it clear. Anthony Albanese lied to Australians when he said he had a plan for cheaper power prices, and every bill, every month, every quarter is a reminder of that lie. Prime Minister, when are the bills coming down? Now, Labor continues to claim that their policies will deliver cheaper power, but instead costs just keep going up, and they can't tell Australians when they might be coming down. We've asked these questions many times, no answers. So the Liberal Party I lead will not stand by and let Australians get crushed by these high power prices. So today, the Liberal Party has decided to put affordable energy first. We will have an energy and emissions policy driven by 2 key objectives: affordable, reliable power and responsible emissions reductions. And our energy and emissions policies will use Australian resources for Australian families so you pay less for your power. Now, the Labor Party has tried to convince you that they can reduce emissions and reduce power prices. In fact, their policy does neither. Emissions are not coming down, power prices are not coming down. We believe that done in the right way, we can have emissions coming down and prices coming down, because affordable energy matters. And it matters no other time greater than right here, right now. Now, as you all know, because you've asked me many questions about the process along the way, the process to get here has been important. And I'm grateful to Dan Tehan for leading the Energy Working Group, which will continue to develop process, noting that we are 2.5 years away from an election. And the next stage of this, after the Liberal Shadow Ministry decided our Liberal Party policy today, is to settle a joint coalition policy with the Nationals. And I said that 3 of my colleagues would be involved in that. Dan Tehan is one, and Senator Anne Ruston and Senator John O'Doniam are the second and third members of that trio that will very soon start those conversations with the Nationals, so that we hope and anticipate we can land, after Sunday, a joint policy that allows us all to fight the Labor Party, to go to the Australian community where we have spent so much time in the last 6 months talking to people, talking to families, hearing the pain of how higher power prices, and genuinely demonstrate that our priority of affordable electricity while responsibly reducing emissions is the right one. I'll hand over to Dan to give you some further details.
Thanks, Susan. Our policy is about 3 things. We're about energy affordability first, where Labor is about energy costs. We're about growing our economy, whereas Labor is about strangling our economy. And we're about doing our fair share, whereas Labor is about racing ahead of the world. Can I start by saying thank you to Susan? 6 months ago, and I think it was nearly 6 months ago today, Susan said we are going to develop a policy process, and it's going to be a thorough policy process. And she put everything on the table. And so as a result of that, we established a process so that we could come here today and give you a policy which was approved by the Liberal Party. And that is what we have done. Obviously now we have to continue the ongoing discussions that we've been having with the National Party. But I cannot think of a more thorough and respectful policy process than what we have undertaken over the last 6 months. And I thank you, Susan, for that. As a result of that, I've been in discussions with colleagues. Obviously, we've been meeting through the backbench, through Simon Kennedy and Jane Hume, the working group with the National Party, and obviously we had the Liberal Party room meet yesterday and the Shadow Ministry meet today. And as a result of all that, you have the policy which we are announcing today. Now, the first thing I want to touch on is what we are doing about energy affordability. That is all going to be about energy abundance. We have to use our natural resources to make sure that we are bringing as much downward pressure on energy prices as we possibly can. And we should use all those natural resources to do so. So we will put downward pressure on energy prices using the energy abundance that we have as a nation. The second thing is we're going to make sure that we're doing our fair share when it comes to emissions reduction. And we're going to do that in 3 ways. On average, we're going to reduce emissions year on year, like we did successfully in government. And that will be in 5-year blocks according to our nationally determined contributions. We will also make sure that we reduce emissions in line with comparable countries. so that we will be able to look at what like-minded countries are doing overseas and say, okay, we want to be making sure we're doing our fair share when it comes to those comparable countries. And thirdly, we want to be throwing all technologies at emissions reduction. We will be the only party or the only two parties as a coalition that is saying to the Australian people, when it comes to energy abundance, we will use all our resources, and when it comes to reducing emissions, we will also use all the available technology and all the available resources that we have to make sure that we are doing our fair share. I'll leave it there. Once again, thank you, Sussan. Can I say I'm really looking forward to working with Anne and Jono to make sure that we take this process through to its next successful stage. Can I also say to my colleagues, right throughout this process, the respect, the dignified way that you've engaged with me has been an absolute credit to you, and I can't thank you enough.
Ms. Lee?
Thank you. Now, we're going to do a fairly ordered progression of questions to make sure everybody does get their questions. So without necessarily going up and down every row, I'll start with you, Greg.
So you say in this document net zero would be a welcome outcome, although you don't have long-term targets. So is it the coalition's aspiration to reach net zero?
Well, while it's not our policy, as you correctly say, to set long-term targets, net zero would be welcome if we can get there with technology, with choice and with voluntary markets. Make no mistake, we're not pursuing net zero. We are pursuing energy affordability and emissions reduction. And it's really important that we make it clear to the Australian people that we believe we can have far more success in affordable electricity and emissions reduction than the current government. So while they might talk about targets and ideology and all of the other things that I sort of heard the Prime Minister refer to briefly today, all around the politics of this, we're just focused on the households. We want to bring costs down and we want to play our part responsibly, reducing emissions.
No aim for
I've
net
answered
zero
the question, Mark.
Well, I'll pick that up. No aim for net zero. You say you remove the net zero target from your policy, but you remain committed to the Paris Agreement. Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement says aiming, and that is the word in that article, to balance removals of emissions by the second half of the century. In other words, net zero by after 2050. So you're still committed to net zero after 2050?
We are committed to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is about global temperature rises and about reducing emissions. Our policy is firmly focused on reducing emissions and affordable electricity, with the priority being affordable electricity. But I point to the three things that Dan just mentioned, which will determine our emissions reduction policy. That it will be in line with comparable countries, that it will be as fast as technology allows, and that we will absolutely play our part, and it will come down on average year on year. Now, these are tangible things that Australians can effectively reach for and say, right, that's what they're doing. They're not working back from an ideological position or something that sits in an international agreement but that is outside our national interests. We remain committed to Paris, and we made that very clear. And it isn't our policy to set long-term targets, but net zero would be a welcome outcome if it's achieved through technology, choice and voluntary markets. And if you want more details of the policy around voluntary markets, then Dan can provide you with that. Phil.
Thanks, Ms. Lee. Look, I've just read your document, and you're essentially going to dismantle nearly everything Labor's got in place in terms of targets, mechanisms, the whole thing. Can you just square the circle how the investment community would react to that, given they seem to be quite happy for the first time in a long time they've got the long-term certainty to invest. So can you explain how that's not going to be a disincentive to investors just to walk away again like they did in the previous 10 years? And in doing that, you talk about getting prices down by modest targeted underwriting to keep prices down. Are you basically going to build coal or gas or fund the construction of those things and circumvent the private sector? How's that?
I'll get down to talk to the detail in a minute, but I want to say this. We're very happy to dismantle the structures and the regulation and the policies, if you can call them that this Labor government has put in place that are doing nothing to make energy and your electricity bills affordable. Very happy to dismantle them. They are not working, and the proof point is that energy prices, electricity prices, are going up year on year, from a government that stood there in 2 elections and said they would come down. They're actually going up. Meanwhile, there has been this investment in renewable electricity, and we are not anti-renewables at all, but the lack of inertia in the grid, the variability, the intermittency, and the real challenge of the cost of stabilising this grid is something that is being sheeted home to Australian households. This was very obvious to me when I stood at Tomago Aluminium and realised how the biggest energy user in New South Wales, probably in the country, 13% of New South Wales' energy grid, is effectively running up the white flag to say, we can't produce aluminium in this country anymore because the cost of energy is too high.
So just when it comes to, the capacity investment scheme in the short term is basically what we've said. It's going to be technology agnostic, and we will use all available resources as part of that to drive downward pressure on energy prices. Absolutely. And then what we will be looking to develop is an affordable electricity scheme following that, which basically means there's a focus on providing capacity into the system, that baseload capacity into the system. Now, the government is looking at such a scheme. We think that sort of scheme needs to be developed. Obviously, we'll work through, we've outlined some principles as what would guide that. We'll see what the government comes up with. But getting capacity into the system is an absolute priority.
Yes, one at a time.
Thank you. The Paris Agreement requires targets to be set and for them to progress on previous targets. It doesn't allow backsliding. How can you say you're committed to the Paris Agreement? Surely your plan is in breach of Australia's obligations.
Well, our policy will always be in the interests of affordable energy for Australian households. And I'm not going to say there's some detail in an international agreement that prevents us doing what we know we need to be doing for Australians. So in government, we would submit our nationally determined contributions, which are short-term targets under the Paris Agreement.
That's absolutely right. That is what we will do.
But it doesn't address the question that you can't go backwards under Paris. You have to go forward.
So, look, what we would do is we would take this policy to the Australian people at the next election. And the Australian people will make a decision on what they, or who they want to govern them. Do they want to be governed by someone who's putting electricity affordability first, but also doing their fair share when it comes to emissions reduction in the 3 ways that we have set out? Now, when it comes to our nationally determined contributions, we will set those out in those nationally determined contributions from government. But we will go with a mandate for the Australian people, and that is how we will set our national determined
And before I go to the next
contributions.
question, this is constantly evolving, because look at what countries are doing now under the Paris Agreement with their NDCs. They're submitting NDCs that they probably know they can never keep. What we are doing is being honest with the Australian people. You have a government that has promised you 2 things that it has not delivered: affordable energy and reducing emissions, and it hasn't done either. So we're going to be honest, and I think that everybody in engaging with the substance of international agreements, while acknowledging the important framework of a global effort to bring emissions down, we are part of that. Let's be clear-eyed about what this means and what it means for individual countries.
Thank you, Ms Lee. Dan, the policy, as you mentioned there, talks about bringing all new forms of power online for supply, including coal. So just to be clear, are you saying there needs to be new coal in the system? Would you put government money behind new coal projects? And just noting the rate of closure, I think AEMO says 90% out of the grid by 2035. Have you estimated how much that might cost? And if the government needs to foot the bill, what taxpayers will be on the hook for?
So what we've said is we will make sure that we have a technology agnostic approach. So when it comes to the capacity investment scheme, yes, we will support the state governments, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, who are already sweating their coal assets. So we will support them because we've got to make sure we keep capacity in the system. We will take a technology agnostic approach. So we will let the market determine how we go
Just
about
have
that.
any estimate on how much you might need to help them though? Because that's a very quick phase out over the next decade.
So obviously, when we get into government, we will look at all these things, and we don't know when they might close, when they mightn't close, what state governments might do between now and the next election. But what we wanted to do was set very clear principles about how we're going to operate.
Yes, Paul, hang on.
This document says that you want to create investor certainty for all new types of technology, and you say that if technology can get you to net zero, that would be a good outcome. How is that any different from an aspiration or a goal? Aren't you just playing word games?
Others may be playing word games. I could not be more clear when I say we are removing net zero targets and long-term targets from our policy. We're not pursuing a policy of net zero.
To get to it, no?
It's welcome, as I said, if indeed technology allows us to get there.
So you welcome
And
something you don't aspire to it?
well, you're weaving two words together, and I've made my point very clear. But your point is that we need to have an emissions reduction policy that is believable and that is genuine. And I know that when investors understand, because there's a lot of talk about what investors want, I actually think, well, what do the Australian people want? What do they deserve? They deserve affordable power. And our policy is clear. It removes a lot of subsidies, artificial structures, regulation that's in the wrong place and doing the wrong thing. And it's clear. And it actually can deliver investor certainty. Charles.
Thank you. Can I have a question to Senator Ruston, please? Senator, you argued against this in the party room. Your state has been moving towards clean energy. It's running on 88% renewables right now. Just checked. You're now going to argue for it with the Nationals. Is this the best policy for the Liberal Party, and is it something you're happy to sit on the front bench and endorse?
Well, I don't think it's any surprise to anybody that there were a wide range of views that were canvassed in the party room yesterday and in Shadow Ministry today. And I've always been a great believer that the best policies are always delivered when you've got everybody's points of view put forward. I think reality tells us that we were always going to have to come to a compromise, but I'm obviously delighted that we're remaining in Paris and that we're committed to emissions reduction, and I think that is a very positive outcome.
Is this a dark day for the moderates?
Thank you. Just moving along here.
Thank you. And Senator Ruston, again to you and to you, Ms Lee, how do you win city seats with this policy? How do you win any of those seats back, including the Teal seats, with this policy, given your own failed candidates said that climate action was an issue for them at the last election?
Let's not misunderstand what climate action is. If people think that this government's approach to so-called climate action is working, then they should have a really good look at it, because it's actually not bringing emissions down. We brought emissions down. It's moving twice as fast and leading to 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. You have a Labor Party in government that cannot even explain how it will reach net zero by 2050, what it will cost to reach the 2035 targets that it has articulated. Now, our friends in the media didn't really, these are really important questions for the government. How much will it cost to get to 62 to 70% target by 2035? Those questions, if asked, have remained completely unanswered. With respect to the seats that, of course, we will be pitching for and presenting serious, credible, compelling policy alternatives at the next election. They do include the city seats. But I know that people in the city are struggling with affordability of energy costs. I know that people who work in areas that are dependent on energy-intensive industries, whether it be heavy industry, which we no longer seem to have any more of in this country because of the government's policy, whether it be the prospective data centres or AI that all require intensive energy, or whether it be something that is a local small business that is manufacturing from aluminium that is about to close down when Alcoa closes down. These are highly relevant questions to people in the cities. And I talk about mums with kids who are struggling to pay the bills, and I meet them in the cities all the time. I'm just coming along here.
Specifically from Senator Ruston, you've been doing a lot of work in this area. How does this policy meet the moment?
Well, I think the reality here is that we've got a policy before us at the moment, the Albanese government policy, that is seeing power prices go up and emissions not coming down. What we're saying is that we want to make sure that we put a policy in place that, first of all, is believable and achievable, that will put downward pressure on energy prices and obviously the cost of living, but at the same time has got a real and prospect of driving down emissions. We did it when we were last in government, we can do it again when we're in government, and I think Australians expect us to put downward pressure on their cost of living, but at the same time do our bit when it comes to emissions reduction.
Yes, ma'am.
I know we've touched on this, but I just want to ask you personally, do you support extending the life of coal-fired power stations, and would you support opening more of next-generation coal-fired power stations?
Well, I make the point that state governments who have their own climate targets are already extending the life of coal-fired power stations because they have to keep the lights on. Now, you just have to look at what happened in the Iberian blackout to know what does occur when a government or a jurisdiction doesn't take seriously the issue of baseload power. So one faulty photovoltaic inverter in an entire grid had a cascading effect that shut down the entire Iberian Peninsula, which had previously, the market operator there had been saying, look, we can run this on renewables, how good is this? And, you know, gave a real pitch for renewables being able to do it all. And then this happened, 11 people lost their lives, including people who couldn't breathe in ventilators because of a mismanagement of the grid. Now that demonstrates that you need baseload power. You need it in the right place, you need it at the right time, you need it to provide inertia to the grid, and it is what keeps the lights on. So we're technology agnostic when it comes to pulling every lever that we can to make sure that Australians have reliable, affordable power. But every time we talk about that, you can also remind people, as we do, of our policy to have genuine reduction in emissions and play our part under the Paris Accord.
Ms Lee, you talk about affordability. Can you look Australians in the eye today and say that if you win the next election, by the end of that term they'll be paying less for their electricity than they would be at the start?
I can look Australians in the eye and say that prices will always be more affordable under us. And I'm sure I don't have to remind them that for 2 elections, Anthony Albanese stood there, pointed to graphs, waved things around and said life will be cheaper under me and electricity prices would come down by $275. Not only has that not happened, they've actually gone up by $1,300. And now Australians are realising that the small amount of relief that they had comes from a subsidy, which is in effect the government taking money from somewhere else, which is all borrowed on the nation's credit card, to deliver a subsidy that unfortunately is now going to run out. So there is no plan. The government has no plan to deliver households what they deserve. Isn't this the first responsibility of every government, to make sure that its citizens can have access to affordable power in winter, in summer, for manufacturing and for their daily needs? And we've got a government that seems to have walked away from that. Mike.
In this document you commit, it's a question for Mr Tian, commit to reduce year on year the nation's carbon emissions, but you're saying very clearly that you will facilitate the construction of new coal and gas plants. You're also at the same time dismantling the current government's regime that any measure to force emissions reduction. Can you just explain how you will guarantee emissions will fall when you're building the most polluting elements of the economy and you're creating new ones?
Because we did it when we were last in government.
No, but you didn't.
We did it when we were last in government, and what we're going to be doing here, consistent with the market, is throwing all technologies at emissions reduction. So let's take one example, carbon capture and storage, right? Under this government, there has been no proper investment in carbon capture and storage. Yet carbon capture and storage can provide immediate relief when it comes to emissions reduction. We have said that we will make sure that we incentivise all these types of technologies on the emissions reduction funds. We will work with, obviously, industry. As I've said, we're going to set up a voluntary offset market as part of our plan, so that we will work with industry to make sure that they've got all available technologies to be able to offset emissions.
How much does that cost taxpayers? If you're funding CCS and new coal plants to guarantee emissions reduction,
No,
what's the bill?
it's a voluntary market that we will be setting up and establishing. Well, they will. I mean, what we showed when we were last in government, in the last 6 months in government, we set up something similar to a voluntary offset market, and that meant that industries were looking to offset, and they used all sorts of available technologies to do so. And I give you one clear example of how we will do that: carbon capture and storage. I mean, if you read all the documents which are coming from Princeton University, Melbourne University, Queensland University, they say quite clearly, we cannot reduce emissions unless we play a significant role with carbon capture. Well, there's many ways you can look at doing this. For instance, the Singaporean government were out here recently. Now, the Singaporean government are looking to reach bilateral agreements with Australia and with other countries so that they can take our energy, but also there is the ability for them to be able to store emissions. So you can actually create markets, and we could generate a business and an industry from setting up this type of emission reduction framework.
I just make another point before. Hang on, we're going around the grounds. Mike, just before I move on, this government is providing public funding for wind and solar, for renewable energy subsidies to international investors, corporations. It's not in the interests of Australian households because power is not coming down, but there's a massive transfer of taxpayer funds to wind and solar projects, when arguably they are established technologies. We've talked about supporting breakthrough technologies and repurposing funds to do exactly that. That's what Australians would expect of us.
You said you don't have any long-term goals or aspirations, but at the same time you said you wanted to, or you were committed to genuine emissions reduction. Is that a goal, and can you quantify that at all? And tell Australians what success when it comes to genuine emissions reductions looks like for a coalition government?
So our commitment is that we will reduce emissions on average year on year, and I can point to our record in government. That's what we did then, and we will do that in line, doing our fair share with comparable countries, and we'll do it as far and as fast as technologies will allow. So that's our three commitments. It's moving on to Karen. Hang on, we are going around. So
you said you want a greater proportion of base load power in the energy grid. Now, we already hit minimum operating demand because of the penetration of rooftop solar. So if you want more coal-fired base load power in the system, you'll have to tell households to turn off their rooftop solar.
So what your question shows quite clearly is what an abject failure the government's approach has been. What an abject failure the government's approach has been. What we have said is we want to bring energy abundance into the system with a focus on affordability, but we also want to make sure that we have a stable grid, and that is what we will focus on, because you're absolutely right. The current approach of the government, which is based on long-term targets which are cascading down through the system and therefore making decisions which are leading to the current outcomes. What we want to do is we want to change that way. We want to make sure that there is energy. We want to make sure that there is energy abundance which provides downward pressure on electricity prices, because you're right, what's happening now is not working.
And the reason why, can I just add to that? The reason why is because the national energy objectives work backwards from a target that is unrealistic, unachievable, and has ridiculous costs attached. So our point is that, no, it doesn't make sense. And I've got renewable energy infrastructure marching across Western New South Wales, but people are being told it's going to have to be turned off a lot of the time. It makes no sense. And every part of that renewable energy infrastructure is manufactured overseas. Keep going.
You've spoken about knowing what it's like to be a mother struggling with bills, but you're also a grandmother. Are you concerned about the type of planet that your grandchildren are going to inherit, and is this something that you talk about with your family?
Yes, I am. And I think of my 6 grandchildren aged under 6 every day. And I know that it is vital that they have a better world to inherit. But I look at the world that they're set to inherit if the policies of this Labor government continue. And if we do want to talk about climate change, the climate change policies of Labor are failing. They are completely failing. So I can't, in all honesty, say to anyone that you will inherit a better environmentally responsible country under this government's climate change policies. And we all know that because emissions came down under us, they're going up, if not flatlining, under Labor. The other thing that I want to be able to say to my grandchildren is that you should inherit a better standard of living than my generation and your mum and dad's generation. Right now, they are set to inherit the worst standard of living since the Second World War. And I don't think that's fair. And if affordability is central to this proposition, and we know it is, what is more central to it than energy? Because if energy is unaffordable, everything is unaffordable.
Ms Lee, if you win the election in May 2028, when will that mum with small kids open her power bill and see it lower?
Guarantee that energy prices, power bills will be lower under us. But it's 2.5 years until the election, Katina. I think I want to make this point very clear. Those energy bills will be much lower under us. And on the eve of the election, we may be able to give you some further detail, because I'm sure this government's energy policy will have become an ever-increasing train wreck by then. But remember, Anthony Albanese stood there and for 2 elections running said your power bills would come down.
And he put a timeline on that. Is that why you don't want to put a timeline on your promise?
Well, he clearly didn't put anything that made any sense on that, because the promise made no sense. The other thing I want to say, because you are talking about mums opening bills, is that unaffordability across a whole range of factors is getting worse. Young people can't afford homes. This government's intense and ridiculous spending means that we are spending $50,000 a minute on interest on our debt. Every time you hear the Prime Minister being generous, remember this, he's being generous with borrowed money. We also know that the energy rebates, the policies that see more and more spending, the failure to constrain a living within our means, the failures in industrial relations, which I have said my team will tackle so that we have fairer workplaces, increasing productivity and increasing real wages. I know it's not the subject of this press conference, but the modern Labor Party has run a million miles away from the Labor Party of 30 years ago that understood the central proposition that if you increase productivity, you increase real wages, and you work with employers and employees to do just that.
Ms Lee, you have been talking about how under Labor emissions are either flatlining or slightly going up, but over the long term they're forecast to go down. They're not that shy of their 2030 target at the moment. These are targets that you want to scrap. So in the coming years, when Australians are counting the cost of fires and floods and other natural disasters, is your response going to be to them, don't worry, we just did our share? And to Dan Tehan, what is AEMO, the CSIRO Treasury, getting wrong when they repeatedly say that renewables will ultimately be the cheapest form of energy?
I'll simply say, Claire, that don't believe any forecasts this government gives you, because they can't answer your basic questions on what it will cost to provide the 2035 emissions reduction targets. If they can't tell you what that costs or a pathway to getting there, and they gave you neither of those two things, then you should not believe a single word they say about emissions reduction.
Last question.
So the first thing can I say, one of the real telltale signs is that the CSIRO or AEMO will not provide transparently the modelling around the ISP. And the second thing I would say, if you look at the statements that have come out of AEMO, they have to take into account net zero by 2050. They have to take into account renewable energy being reached at 82% by 2030. That all then cascades down, and that's what's driving your power bill up. And not only that, you've got experts like Ross Garnaut coming out and saying that those approaches, those targets, are completely unachievable. So once again, it just goes to prove electricity prices going up and emissions flatlining because of a failed policy.
Now, we said last question, so I'll just...
Thank you, Ms Lee.
For the last question.
You've said you're staying in Paris. Can you just explain your understanding of how that relates to the current national NDC? Those targets, whether they're legislated or not, are part of that international agreement. Can you explain, have you got advice, some other explanation for why you can ignore that target, those numbers for 2030 and 2035? Will you scrap those numbers when you get in?
Well, that's a prospective question, and I believe I've already answered it, but I'll answer it again. Paris is about, yes, giving NDCs, revising them maybe, considering what the rest of the world is doing. But overall, Paris is about a global agreement to bring down temperatures and reduce emissions. That's exactly what we propose to do. And we will look Australians in the eye and say, this is a plan to bring down emissions and to provide affordable energy for you. And if there are reasons why people in Paris or in some United Nations organisation don't like it, I can deal with that.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thanks.